Welcome to the module How to Evaluate Gamification Process of the MOOC Gamification in Higher Education. This MOOC is part of the Big Data for All project, and this is an Erasmus Plus project funded by the European Commission. The objective of this module is as follows. How can we evaluate a gamification process, and more specifically for application in higher education? The learning achievements are as follows: to implement evaluations like surveys, to analyze data to make informed decisions. How can we use best practices to assess gamification in real-world applications? It is also important to look at ethical issues and how to tackle them. And eventually, these findings should also be shared to all the stakeholders involved in order to allow improvements to the gamification process. So when designing an evaluation process, there are a few key characteristics to take into account. First of all, the learning objectives. The learning objectives should always be aligned with the gamification elements that are used or with the gamification context. I will give an example later in this video. Next, gamification elements. There are quite some elements that we can implement, such as points and badges. It is important to evaluate how efficient all of those elements are in a specific use case. Next, the learner engagement. We also need to measure how engaged a learner is by measuring the frequency, duration, and quality of the interactions. The learner outcomes. It is important to evaluate the effect of gamification on the outcome. So we can do this by measuring knowledge gain, skill development, and behavior shift. And eventually, feedback mechanisms. If we have some feedback mechanisms implemented, it is important to assess the impact of those feedback mechanisms and also to make changes if required. So when we design an evaluation process, we should ask ourselves some relevant questions. So first, what are the specific objectives and the goals of this gamification experience? What metrics and indicators have been established to measure the progress and outcomes? What data analysis techniques have been used to analyze all the data that was collected? And what evaluation methods have been used? There are quite some that we can use. 5, what are the strengths and weaknesses of gamification? Because it is a very important and powerful tool. But there are also some strengths and weaknesses to take into account. How well does the gamified experience meet the needs and the preference of the target audience? The audience are both the learners as the instructors. Next, what ethical considerations have been taken into account in the gamification process? And here we think about privacy, bias, fairness. And then eventually, how can the evaluation findings, so how can the feedback be used to improve the gamification process? So to answer all of these questions, it's more meaningful if we take a real-world example. And in this case, we like to present to you the language learning platform. So imagine a platform where the users can log in. So those are users who want to learn a new language by both following some theoretical sessions, but also by practicing. In this platform, there are also some gamification elements implemented, such as points, badges, and leaderboards, and they help to motivate the learners. So first of all, what are the specific objectives and goals in this example? It is to measure and evaluate how engaged these learners are. And more general, we want to improve the learning experience and improve also the knowledge retention and the knowledge gain. What data, and more specifically metrics and indicators, have been established to measure the progress and outcomes? Here we have quite some metrics that are available. First, the engagement metrics. So those are about frequency and duration of the engagement. The progress metrics are about how many points are earned, how many levels are completed. Learning metrics are about improvement in skill if we compare it before and after the gamification process. Behavioral metrics are all about motivation. Satisfaction metrics, so gamification can be very interesting to implement, but it is also important that the users are satisfied with the result. Retention metrics are about the fact that users may leave your platform, so this is churning. But if you're lucky, they come back. So this is actually shown in the return rate. So we want to keep the churn rate as low as possible, but if we have some churn, we want to have a high return rate. 7, the business impact metrics. Maybe it is not that important or relevant in this use case, but in case we have a commercial learning platform, it is also important to look at sales and customer loyalty. And then eventually the feedback metrics. It is important to enable students, learners, and also instructors to leave feedback in the form of a review or a rating. So next, we can do some data analysis to analyze all the data that has been collected in the previous step. So first of all, we can do a descriptive analysis, and this helps us to understand how averages scores are formed, how completion rates, what they actually mean. Next, we can look at historical data and do a predictive analysis. So this allows us to do some predictions, to do a forecast about future behavior and engagement. In our platform, we have different users, also different gamification elements. By doing a comparative analysis, we can analyze the differences between the users, also between their engagement, but on the other hand, also between the different gamification elements and features. What's also important is visualization techniques. So before doing any of the aforementioned analysis methods, we can start by looking at the data in form of charts, graphs, and heat maps. So this will give us a first idea. Cluster analysis helps us to segment users that are quite identical or quite similar based on their behavior or performance. Sentiment analysis can also be conducted when we enable learners to leave feedback. We can use that information to get an idea what a sentiment is. So for example, if a learner leaves a very bad review, we can do some analysis and then we have a general idea of what his feeling is about the platform. A/B testing will allow us to compare different game elements, so which elements are perceived as more natural or more compelling. And then eventually the learner analytics, it is important to analyze the performance, engagement, and the progress. So for what evaluation methods have been used in this specific use case of the learning platform, actually there is some overlap with the third question, but we can say that we used evaluation methods with respect to user engagement. So how often and how long did the learner spend on the platform? Motivation, how many time was spent online? How many ratings were filled? The knowledge gain is also important, and this can be assessed by assessments and by short quizzes. Gamification is quite a powerful instrument, but there are also some strengths and weaknesses. In this case, the strengths are, of course, the engagement, motivation. It allows also to learn on a very interactive way, and it may change the behavior of the students by using these gamification techniques. But there are also some weaknesses. So by implementing gamification, a weakness may be that there is an overemphasis on rewards, so on winning, rather than on gaining knowledge. Equality is also important because all of the students are actually different in the knowledge that they already have, but they should also be treated equally, so there should be a balance in the types of questions that are asked. Also important is not to overcomplicate both the content but also the user interface, and to make sure that the gamification process is sustainable. So it is an iterative process where you should always evaluate the process and make some changes if necessary. 6. How well does the gamification experience meet the needs and the preference of the target audience? Here we will use some assessments and interviews, both for the instructors and the students, to verify if they are satisfied with the implementation of gamification. There are some ethical considerations that need to be taken into account. First of all, intrinsic motivation. When we implement gamification, it is important that students are not gaming too much, but that there is also the right balance with information gain. Also, privacy. The platform should be compliant to GDPR, and more specifically, data minimization is an important aspect. And this means that the data that you gather about the students, that you only gather the required information and only keep it for the time that is needed and not longer. Fairness, that you treat all users equally. Addiction, since we have gamification elements, people may be addicted, so it is important to avoid this compulsive behavior. The platform should be accessible for everyone, also for disabled people, and transparency should also be implemented, so users should understand how the scoring works, but also should have an idea of what kind of data is captured of them. Then 8, how can the evaluation findings be used to inform future iterations? So how can we use these findings to improve the platform? It's important to identify strengths and weaknesses of the platform by doing some surveys. Also to balance the game mechanics. If we see that the game mechanics are not well balanced, then we can refine the reward system. If we also notice that the learners are not doing the gamification elements in the right way, we can implement new features. And it is also important to address ethical issues. Thank you very much for your attention.